There were giants in the earth in those days. That's not folklore. That's not a fantasy novel. That's Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, sitting in your Bible right now, probably a few feet from where you're watching this. And that's it. No footnote. No, here's a metaphor. No wink. The book that gives you the 10 Commandments, that Jesus quoted from constantly, the foundational text of Western civilization, just states it flatly, in the same matter-of-fact voice it uses for genealogies and geography. There were giants. In those days, on the earth. Most people read right past it, because it's so strange their brain just kind of skips it. And then it does something even stranger. It tells you where they came from. And the answer is not big people. The answer is that something came down from outside the human race, took human women, and had children with them. And those children were the giants. Now, you have a choice when you hit a verse like that. You can do what most Sunday sermons do, which is speed up and hope nobody asks. Or you can stop and actually read what it says and follow it, because the Bible does not drop the subject in Genesis 6. The giants come back, over and over. They're in Numbers, they're in Deuteronomy. Goliath is one. There's a king whose bed was 14 feet long. This isn't one weird verse. It's a thread that runs through the whole Old Testament, and it's connected to one of the most disturbing commands God ever gave. So today, we're going to follow the thread all the way. Who the Nephilim actually were, what the oldest sources, including a book found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, say happened before the flood, why the giants survived a flood that was supposed to end them, and why, in the end, all of it points at a single bloodline and a single promise made in a garden about a child who would crush a serpent's head. Let's go back before the flood. The sentence nobody wants to explain. Let's actually read Genesis 6, because the whole thing is only a few verses, and every word is loaded. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Stop right there. The sons of God. That's the phrase the entire mystery hangs on. Because who are the sons of God? Here's where it gets contested, so let me be fair and give you the honest landscape. There are two main readings, and I'll tell you up front which one the oldest sources go with and why. Reading 1, the tame one, says the sons of God were just the godly male descendants of Adam's son Seth, and the daughters of men were the ungodly women from Cain's line. And this is a story about believers marrying unbelievers. That's it. No supernatural anything. And a lot of modern churches teach this, mostly because it's comfortable. But here's the problem with the tame reading. It doesn't explain the giants. If this is just godly guys marrying ungodly girls, why are their kids a race of enormous, superhuman beings that terrify everyone? Ordinary marriage doesn't produce giants. The tame reading has to quietly ignore the entire reason the passage exists. Reading 2, and this is the ancient one. The one every Jewish source before the time of Christ held, the one the writers of the New Testament assumed, says the sons of God are exactly what that phrase means everywhere else in the Old Testament: angelic beings, members of God's heavenly court. In the book of Job, the sons of God show up to present themselves before the Lord, clearly not humans, clearly heavenly. So when Genesis uses that exact phrase, the ancient readers didn't blink. They knew. This is about heavenly beings coming down and crossing a line they were never supposed to cross. And the offspring get a name: the Nephilim. Your Bible often just translates it giants, but the Hebrew word Nephilim most likely comes from a root meaning to fall, the fallen ones, or the ones who cause others to fall. A hybrid, half heavenly, half human. Wrong. Something that was never supposed to exist. And the text tells you what they were like. Mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Heroes, the legends. And here's a thought that should reframe every myth you've ever heard. Every ancient culture has stories of demigods, half god, half human heroes of impossible strength. Hercules, Gilgamesh. The offspring of gods and mortals, over and over, in every mythology on earth. What if those aren't just stories? What if they're the distorted memory of something that actually happened, that Genesis tells you about plainly in 6 verses? A time when beings from outside came down and fathered a generation of monsters that the whole world remembered as heroes. And I want to sit on that mythology point for a second, because it's bigger than a fun coincidence. Go culture by culture. The Greeks have the Titans and the demigods. Hercules, half Zeus, impossible strength. The Mesopotamians have Gilgamesh, described as part god, 2/3 divine, a giant king. Norse myth has the giants, the Jotnar, an entire race of them at war with the gods. Native American traditions, all over the continent, carry stories of a vanished race of red-haired giants. The Bible calls them Nephilim. Everybody else called them heroes and gods and monsters. But the shape is identical. A time, long ago, when beings from above mixed with humanity and produced offspring of terrifying size and power. When one culture tells a strange story, it's a myth. When every culture on Earth independently tells the same strange story, you have to at least ask whether they're all remembering something. Genesis doesn't treat it as myth, it treats it as history. The sober, 6-verse account of the thing the rest of the world turned into legend. Now, where do we get the details? Because Genesis is short, 6 verses. Somebody wrote the long version, and a copy of it was sitting in a cave by the Dead Sea for 2,000 years. The long version. The long version is the Book of Enoch, and the piece we care about most is a section called the Book of the Watchers, and a related text, the Book of Giants, that turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Together, they fill in what Genesis leaves as a whisper. And the story is this. 200 angelic beings, the Watchers, are looking down at the earth, at human women, and they want them. And their leader, an angel named Semjaza, knows this is forbidden, and he's afraid to do it alone. So he makes the others swear an oath, all 200 of them, binding themselves together on the summit of Mount Hermon, so that no single one of them carries the blame. And they come down, and they take wives, and 2 things happen. First, the Watchers start teaching humanity things humans weren't ready for, and the list is oddly specific. Azazel teaches men to forge swords and shields and knives, the technology of organized killing. He teaches women cosmetics, the art of painting the face and the eyes, the weaponizing of beauty. Another Watcher teaches the casting of spells and the cutting of roots for sorcery. Another, the reading of the lightning. Another, the signs of the stars, astrology. Another, the course of the moon. Watch what all of it has in common. Every single teaching is a shortcut, a way to get power or knowledge or control without God and behind his back. It's the same offer from the garden. You shall be as gods, just handed out wholesale, item by item, to the whole human race. We've done whole videos on each of these Watchers, one at a time. That's the entire series on this channel. But second, and this is the Genesis 6 part, their wives have children. And the children are the Nephilim, the giants. And the Book of Enoch does not describe them as gentle. It describes a catastrophe. These hybrids grow to enormous size, with enormous appetites, and they begin to consume everything. First the crops, then the animals. Then, when there's nothing left, the text says they turned on humanity itself, and then on each other. A world being eaten alive by the offspring of the fallen, a planet drowning in violence long before it drowned in water. And that's the detail that unlocks Genesis for you. Because 2 verses after the giants show up, Genesis says this: "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man." And then comes the flood. We usually tell the flood story like God got fed up with people being naughty. But read it in context. The flood comes right after the sons of God cross the line and fill the earth with giants and violence. The flood isn't a tantrum, it's a quarantine. The bloodline of humanity is being corrupted, genetically, spiritually, from the outside, and the flood is the surgery. Noah, the text is careful to say, was perfect in his generations. A lot of people think that means he was morally perfect. The Hebrew word is about lineage. It may be saying Noah's bloodline was still clean, uncorrupted, which is exactly why his family is the one that gets carried through the water. So the flood makes a terrible kind of sense now. It's not God overreacting to sin. It's God preserving one clean human line through a corruption event that threatened to swallow the whole species. The Nephilim are the reason for the flood, which raises the single biggest question in this entire subject, and almost nobody asks it out loud. If the flood was meant to wipe out the giants, then why, after the flood, are there still giants? The giants that survived. Because there are. That's the part that should stop you cold. You'd think a global flood sent partly to deal with the Nephilim would be the end of them. Genesis 6 even seems to close the book on them. Except it doesn't. Look at the exact wording. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. And also after that. 4 words, easy to miss, and they tell you the giants come back on the other side of the flood. And the rest of the Old Testament proves it. Fast forward hundreds of years. Moses sends 12 spies into the Promised Land to scout it out. 10 of them come back terrified, and here's their report, word for word. We saw the Nephilim there, and we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we were in their sight. Grasshoppers. Grown men describing themselves as insects next to the people living in the land. The giants are back, and they're living in Canaan. And they've got names now, whole clans of them. The Anakim, the sons of Anak, famous for their height. The Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim. These aren't vague legends in the text. They're listed like nations, with territories and cities. And then there's the king, Og, king of Bashan. And Deuteronomy does something almost funny. It stops the narrative to give you a museum exhibit. It says, in effect, in case you don't believe how big this guy was, his bed is on display in the city of Rabbah, and you can go measure it yourself. And then it gives the dimensions. 9 cubits by 4 cubits. That's roughly 14 feet long and 6 feet wide. A bed. For one man. The Bible is standing there pointing at the furniture, saying, look, we're not exaggerating. Go look. And here's where somebody in the comments is already typing. But what about the giant skeletons? So let me deal with that honestly, because you deserve the real answer, not a hype video. There are a lot of stories out there. Old newspaper clippings from the 1800s and early 1900s reporting 8, 9, 10-foot skeletons dug up out of burial mounds across America, and claims that the Smithsonian quietly made them all disappear to protect the mainstream timeline. And I'll be straight with you. Most of those specific claims don't hold up. A lot of the famous photos are proven hoaxes, clever fakes made for fun or for money. So no, I'm not going to stand here and tell you there's a warehouse of giant bones and a government cover-up, because I can't prove that, and I won't sell you something I can't prove. But here's what's fair to say, and it's more interesting than the hoaxes. The historical record, real, documented accounts, not doctored photos, is genuinely full of reports of unusually large human skeletons, going back centuries, from serious people who had no reason to lie. Whether everyone is exaggerated, we can't always know, because in a lot of cases the remains weren't preserved. What I can tell you is that you don't actually need a skeleton in a museum to take the Nephilim seriously. Because your evidence isn't a photograph, it's a text that was being copied 1,000 years before Christ, that names the clans, that gives you the dimensions of a bed you could go measure. The Bible's claim about giants doesn't rise or fall on a newspaper clipping. It stands on the oldest manuscripts on earth. So let's get back to those. So how did giants survive a flood meant to end them? The text doesn't spell it out, and honestly, this is where careful people admit we're piecing it together. But the most straightforward reading of Genesis is right there in those 4 words, and also after that. Whatever happened before the flood happened again after it. The sons of God crossed the line a second time. The corruption came back, which is why the giants show up again in Canaan, and why the command God gives about them is so shocking. Because when Israel finally enters the Promised Land, God tells them to completely destroy certain peoples, utterly, men, women, children. And that command has troubled readers for centuries. It sounds monstrous. But look at who lives in exactly those regions: the Anakim, the Rephaim, the giant clans. Read in the light of Genesis 6, that horrifying command starts to look less like ethnic cleansing and more like the completion of the flood, the finishing of a quarantine, the removal of a corrupted bloodline that the water didn't fully reach. I'm not saying that dissolves every hard question about those passages. It doesn't, but it reframes them completely. This isn't Israel wanting land. This is the last chapter of a war that started when 200 beings broke an oath on a mountain. And the last giant standing in that war is the most famous one of all: the last giant. Because you already know one Nephilim story. You just never filed it under Nephilim. A young shepherd, a valley, a giant, over 9 feet tall by the plain reading of the text, in bronze armor, with a spear like a weaver's beam, stepping out every morning to defy the armies of the living God. Goliath. Goliath was from Gath, and Gath is named in the book of Joshua as one of the last places the Anakim, the giant clans, survived. Goliath isn't a random big soldier. He's a leftover, the tail end of the bloodline that the flood didn't finish and the conquest of Canaan didn't fully clean out. He is, in a very real sense, one of the last of the Nephilim line, standing in a valley, taunting God's people, exactly like his ancestors did. And look at who God sends against him. Not the biggest man in Israel, not the king, Saul, who was famously tall, hid in his tent. God sends a boy, with no armor, with a sling and 5 smooth stones. And the boy drops the giant with a single stone to the forehead and cuts off his head with the giant's own sword. Do you see the pattern the Bible is drawing? The whole giant saga began with beings of enormous power exalting themselves against heaven. We'll take what we want. We'll cross any line. And it keeps ending the same way. Not with a bigger giant, with the small, the humble, the overlooked, empowered by God, bringing the whole thing down. David didn't beat Goliath with strength. He beat him by belonging to God. The giant had the size. The boy had the covenant. And the covenant wins every single time. And there's a reason David picked up 5 stones, not 1, that you almost never hear. Later in the same books, in a couple of verses nobody ever preaches, you find out Goliath wasn't alone. He had brothers, a whole family of giants from Gath. One of them is named Lami. Another is described with a detail so specific it has to be a real memory. 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. And the text says, plainly, these were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and his servants. Fell by the hand of David and his servants. Read that slowly. It's a mopping up operation. After Goliath goes down in the valley, David and his men spend years hunting the rest of the clan, one giant at a time, in chapters the Sunday school flannel graph never covered. The 5 stones weren't nervousness. David was finishing a bloodline. The last of the Nephilim were being cleared off the board, one by the covenant people. Closing a war that began before the flood, on the far side of a global catastrophe, up on a mountain, with an oath. Which brings us to the thing all of this was pointing at from the very beginning. Why any of this matters. Because here's the question under the whole thing. Why would fallen powers work so hard to corrupt the human bloodline in the first place? 200 of them, breaking an oath, coming down, fathering monsters, doing it again after the flood, populating Canaan with giants. Why? What was the point? What were they trying to stop? And the answer takes you all the way back to the very first pages of the Bible, to a promise made in a garden, right after everything went wrong. When Adam and Eve fall, God turns to the serpent, the being behind the rebellion, and he says something cryptic. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Her seed, a descendant of the woman, a human being, born into this world, is going to come and crush the head of the serpent. That's the first promise of a rescuer in the entire Bible, made in Genesis 3. And from that moment on, there is a target painted on the human bloodline. Because if a human deliverer is coming through Eve's descendants, then the surest way to stop him is to poison the well, to corrupt humanity so thoroughly from the outside that no clean human line survives for the rescuer to be born through. Do you see it now? That's what the Nephilim were. Not just monsters, a strategy, an attack on the bloodline the Messiah was going to come through. Fill the earth with hybrids, corrupt the human race genetically and spiritually, and there will be no clean line left. No woman seed. No rescuer. Checkmate. And the flood is God's answer. One clean family, carried through the water. The line survives. And every time the corruption comes back, the giants in Canaan, the sons of Enoch, Goliath in the valley, it's the same war, the same target, the same enemy trying to break the one bloodline that matters. And every time, God preserves it. Through Noah, through Israel, through a shepherd boy who happened to be the ancestor of a king. Because David, the boy who killed the giant, is the direct ancestor of Jesus. The line that the Nephilim were trying to destroy from before the flood runs straight through David, straight to a manger in Bethlehem, to the child who was, at last, the woman's seed. The one the serpent had been trying to stop for the entire span of human history. And on a cross, that child let the serpent bruise his heel, and in rising, he crushed the serpent's head. The promise from the garden kept. The war that started when 200 beings broke an oath on Mount Hermon, finished by the one bloodline they could never quite manage to poison. That's why the giants matter. They're not a horror movie subplot. They're the enemy's longest, most desperate attempt to stop a promise. And they lost. So, the Nephilim. Not a metaphor, not a mistranslation. The Bible says it plainly in Genesis, and then never lets it go. Beings from outside came down, crossed a line, and fathered a race of giants that filled the earth with violence before the flood, and came back after it. The whole strange thread, from the sons of God to Og's 14-foot bed, to a boy in a valley with a sling, is one story. A war over a bloodline. A target painted on humanity from the moment a promise was made in a garden. And the reason your Sunday sermon skips Genesis 6 isn't that it's not there. It's that once you actually read it, the whole Bible gets bigger and stranger, and a lot more like a battlefield than a rule book. Which it is. If that's the kind of thing you'd rather have explained honestly than skipped over politely, subscribe. Every week, we read the parts most people speed past. And next time, we go inside the strangest of all of it, the Book of Giants itself, the one from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because before the water came, the giants started having dreams, nightmares of a coming judgment, and they sent one of their own on a desperate journey to find the only man who could tell them what the dreams meant, what Enoch told them, and how they reacted when they realized there was no escape, is one of the most haunting things in any ancient text. I'll see you there.